Okay, so as we move into Hebrews chapter 4, right down near the end, we're going to be finishing up that chapter, and we'll go through. Really, the goal is to go through all of chapter 5 tonight. Hebrews, the constant theme to it is don't drift. It's that attitude and disposition that leads somebody to slip back in to old habits and old ways pre-Christ. And so all of us have them. We all have things and habits and tendencies that we bring with us when we become Christians. And we all, as human beings, tend to gravitate towards that which is normal. And for the people that the book of Hebrews is written to, those Christians there, their normal was Judaism. It was that old law and all of the ceremonies and sacrifices and whatnot associated with it. And so as we go through Hebrews, don't drift back into that. So we're going to have this back and forth. And we've already seen it, and we'll see more of it as we progress through the book of here's what you have in the new law, and it's comparing it to the old law is just very far better. You'll have those sort of compare and contrast statements that are made over and over between the old and the new law. And then over here, you're going to see those exhortation statements. Those don't drift, don't be sluggish, hold fast, don't neglect, over and over and over again. Move forward toward Christ. Be active in your Christianity, not passively slipping. And so as we move into Hebrews chapter 4, down to verse 14, it begins a section that will go from verse 14 through chapter 5, verse 10. So this is really one section here from verse 14 of this chapter to verse 10 of the next chapter. And as we look at it, the point of this chapter is going to be we have a great high priest. And what he's going to do is something that's a little different. It's a little different for us in the way that we normally make arguments. Normally, what somebody will do is they'll say, look at this evidence, and look at this evidence, and look at this evidence, therefore, and then they'll give their conclusion. In this case, what we're going to see is, here's the conclusion that I want you to come to. He's going to tell it to you up front. This is what I want you to see. And then he's going to go and he's going to give you the reasons why. So he'll give you the evidence second. So in chapter 4, we see the conclusion. And the conclusion is, having then a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but one that has been in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore draw near with boldness unto the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and may find grace to help us in time of need. That's what he wants you to see. And I have bolded there kind of the main points of each verse. He wants you to hold fast your confession of Christ. Now the confession is that you are a Christian, that He is the Son of God. As Peter says in Acts chapter 4, can't remember exact verse 12 or so maybe, Peter will say, there is no other name under heaven by which men may be saved. That's the confession. What's the name that you confess? Jesus. And he says, I want you to hold fast to that confession. Don't slip back to Moses. Hold on to Jesus. And then in verse 15, his main point is, you have a high priest that is touched with feeling regarding you. That is, I want you to realize you matter to Christ. You matter to Jesus. You matter to God. And then draw near with boldness. That is, I want you to have confidence in your salvation. I want you to stand before God and prepare to stand before Him on the day of judgment with a hope in your heart and an excitement and a belief that you know where you're going. Don't tentatively approach God, but do it with confidence. Just like Paul, as he neared death, he says, I fought the good fight, and there is laid up for me a crown. That was his confidence. In the same way as you pray, when you approach God in prayer, how should it be? Don't be tentative about it, but pray, oh God in heaven, we know you hear prayers. I believe that was what Mitchell said as he was praying. He made the point. He said, God, we know. We know you listen to our prayers, so please take care of this and please take care of that. That confidence is something that should be not just in our words, but in our heart and in every aspect of our behavior, knowing where we're going and who it is that we're approaching. And we can do so with confidence because of the quality of high priest we have. Now, that's the conclusion. So we start with the end. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go look at the evidence, and then we're going to go back and look at these verses again after we have the evidence under our belt. So as we move into chapter 5, he's going to talk about the high priest. Now, there are three different roles within the Jewish religious tribe. Within the tribe that was in charge of the religious ceremony of the sacrifices and the temple and all those sorts of things, there were three groups. There were the Levites. Now, a Levite was simply somebody who was from the tribe of Levi. Of the 12 tribes, you have the tribe of Levi, and anybody who was of that tribe was a Levite. Now, the Levites were in charge of moving the tabernacle. When that tabernacle was moved from one place to another, and they had to pick it up and move it through the desert, and God would say, follow the pillar of cloud by day, go where it goes, they'd have to pack everything up. Just like breaking down a normal tent. And the Levites were in charge of that. They were in charge of the movement of these things. Then you had, within the Levite tribe, there were the priests. Now the priests were all of Aaron's family. They were all, that's why we call it the Aaronic priesthood. They were all descendants of Aaron. Priests were in charge of things like burning the incense and making sure that the daily offerings of sacrifice were made by the individual. Somebody came and they said, I want to make a burnt offering. The priests were in charge of doing that. If there's a sin offering needed to be made, they were in charge of all those things. And then there was one guy, and he was the high priest. Now the high priest was also of Aaron's family, but he was also Aaron's successor. There was a direct successor from father to son was typically how it went within the Aaronic lineage, and one guy at a time held that job. And that guy had a particularly specific role. He wasn't just there to boss around the other priests. He had a specific job, and Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1 tells us what that job was. For every high priest being taken from among men, is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. The high priest was in charge of approaching God on behalf of the people once a year. Once a year, he had the job of going into the Holy of Holies, right there where the ark was kept. And he would go in there and he would approach God for God to forgive the people of their sins, the national forgiveness of sins for the whole nation. And that was his job. That was the most, here were other things he did, but ultimately that was it. That was the thing that mattered. And that's what verse 5 says. He was appointed for men or on behalf of men in things pertaining to God to offer those sacrifices for sin. He was the guy who stood between man and his Maker, and he was there to offer those sacrifices to make it so that man could be right with his Maker, to make sure that he was forgiven of any sort of sin or rebellion against God. Now, as you look in Hebrews chapter 5, he's going to lay out the things that make a qualified high priest. If you're going to have a high priest that is the way that God intended the high priest to be in the Old Testament, he had to have a couple of things. And the first thing he mentioned there in verse 1, he's taken from among men, on behalf of men. That is, the high priest, he has to understand that his job is to mediate between man and God, not because of God, but because of man. Because man needed somebody to step in on his behalf. So a high priest, his job, it's to stand between man and God, but not for God's sake, but instead for man's sake. Because man needed somebody to stand in there and say, God, please help us. Then the second thing is he's to offer sacrifices. That is, a high priest, he must be able to stand before God as somebody capable of offering sacrifices before God, which means he's got to be a faithful man. If you had a priest who was not faithful to God, it was not going to work. He had to be somebody that could stand before God and intercede for the people. Now, a good example of when this didn't work was not with the high priest per se, but with his sons. Eli had two sons. They were wicked men, and they would take the sacrifices, and they weren't giving the proper sacrifices. They'd take the best parts for themselves. The people would come to make sacrifices, and they'd take the best part. And people would say, hey, that's the part that belongs to God. And they'd say, no, we'll take it. And it was displeasing to God. So an unfaithful man can't do the job. He can't stand before God and make those sacrifices if he wasn't a faithful and good man. I don't know why it says 1, 1, 1, by the way, but I figure you all can count. And then the third thing is, he's got to be gentle. Now, look here in verse 2. He's to order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness. He has to be a man who is familiar with weakness, so he can be gentle with the people he's high priest for. After all, if you have a high priest and he has no love in his heart for his fellow man, and he just looks at them with disdain or condescension, that guy's going to be of zero use. The people say, we need you to make sacrifices for us. And if he doesn't have any love for them, he'll just, you guys don't matter. So he must be a gentle person to deal with those who are misguided, to deal with those who are ignorant. And the way that typically happened was the high priest was gentle because he also was weak. Now, when we say the high priest was weak himself, like those misguided and ignorant people, what we mean in almost all the cases of him being weak is he sinned too. He knew what it was like to sin. He knew what it was like to do the wrong thing when you wanted to do the right thing. He was familiar with failure. And so he knew he had that weakness to him, and it led him to be the kind of man to be gentle with others. But verse 3 makes out the point, because of his weakness, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, so also for himself. Now, we have a problem with the high priest in almost all circumstances. Now, I say almost all because there's one high priest who doesn't have this problem, and it's ours. Almost all high priests, though, had sin, so they had to make sacrifices for their own sin and failures, as well as those of the people. Now, that sin in their life, it showed them, it made them compassionate for others, but it also was a problem. And then the last is, he must be given honor by God. To be a good high priest, you can't just wake up in the morning and say, I want to be the high priest. Doesn't work that way. If you look down in verse 4, it says, no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. When Aaron was made high priest, it wasn't because the people looked around and they said, who do we want to be high priest? Hey, we like Aaron. That wasn't how it was done. God came, and God spoke through Moses and gave a law. Exodus 28, I believe, is where it was, you first see it, where God says, Aaron and his descendants will be my high priests. From the lineage of Aaron are going to come the high priest. He's going to be the first one, and then his descendants will succeed him. God gave him that honor. And of course, this makes sense because he's going to mediate between two parties, isn't he? Between man and God. And so God has to say, yeah, I'm okay with this guy mediating. I'm okay with this guy standing before me. I'm okay with it. And if God, of course, isn't okay with it, then he's going to be displeased with the offering. A great example of that is just in the simple example of Saul. When King Saul made an offering to God, he was the king, and God was displeased with his sacrifice because he didn't have a right to do it. He was a king, he wasn't a priest. So, these are the qualifications that Hebrews chapter 5 says. These are the things that a high priest has to have. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay, so then we move down, and we're going to now begin to look at Jesus. Can Jesus meet the qualifications to be the high priest? Is he qualified for that job? So, as you start reading in verse 5, it says, "So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' Just as he says also in another passage, 'You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.' In the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. And although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." Now, as you look at those verses, verse 5 through verse 10, I want you to see what's said there in those verses. Number one, the high priest has to be one who is sent, appointed on behalf of men to help save men. We'll look down in verse 9. What did Jesus become to all those who obey him? The source of eternal salvation. What is Jesus? He came to save. Jesus himself said, "I came to seek and save that which was lost." So he certainly meets that qualification. A high priest has to be there to help man, to intercede for man with God. Well, Jesus certainly did that. Then he has to be pious. He has to be a faithful man. He has to be somebody you can look to and say, that's a man right with God. Well, look in verse 7. In the days of his flesh, that is when Jesus was here down on earth in the flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. What kind of a man was Jesus? Would you say he was faithful? Now, I'm asking these questions knowing full well, of course he was faithful. But that's what we're doing here. Let's talk about here. If a high priest has to be faithful, go back to Aaron. Aaron was faithful, but did Aaron ever struggle with being faithful? Who was the guy who made that golden calf? Oh, right. That was Aaron. Now, if Aaron we consider qualified to be a high priest, I mean, after all, he's got to be qualified. He's the first guy God picked. How about Jesus? When Jesus prayed, how did he pray? Loud crying, tears to the one who's able to save him. And he was heard. No, in other words, it wasn't just a show. When Jesus prayed, it was the real thing. Oftentimes, when we hear about Jesus praying, what would he do? Was most of his prayer in public or in private? It will talk about Jesus going off to a mountain somewhere. He'd go to pray in private. That's a sign of a sincere man. It's not just a show for everybody else. He was truly a faithful man. Now that's that point there is, here's Jesus. You look at him, how many prayers did he offer? What sort of supplication did he pray to God? How many times did he pray on behalf of others even? You go over to John chapter 16 and you read Jesus' prayer there on behalf of his apostles. And you read one of the most beautiful, heartfelt prayers of all time. And all of it is about, God, I'm going to go and I'm going to die, and God, please take care of these people when I'm gone. Please watch out for them. I pray on their behalf and for all those who come after him. It's heartfelt, it's sincere, and it's an interceding prayer. Now, if you have a high priest, isn't that kind of high priest you want? Faithful before God and more than happy to pray on your behalf. And then it talks about that other qualification. He's got to be gentle. He's got to be familiar with weakness. Now, most high priests, as I said, they were familiar with weakness because they sinned. That's a real good way to become familiar with your weakness. Just fall on your face. Well, Jesus didn't do that. He never did sin. But as you look down at the verses, what does it say? Down in verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect. Now, we've talked about that back in chapter 2, down in verse 10, when it talks about Jesus being made perfect. That often throws us. What do you mean? I thought he was already perfect. No, in this sense, the perfect here just means complete. He was made the perfect what? The perfect Savior is what he was made. He was made the perfect one to save us from sins. And how was he made perfect? He learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Now, when Jesus came down here on earth, that's another word we kind of shy away from. You mean tell me Jesus learned something when he was down here on earth? I thought he was God. Yes, he is. And the only way I can think to compare it is the difference between book learning and actual experience. You know, I'll talk with Jordan sometimes, and Jordan, he went and got that engineering degree. Books and books and books and books, all filled his head with all those things, and now he works at Starbucks as an engineer. And you know what? There's a difference between working in engineering and learning engineering. There's some things you say, oh, I remember reading about that. This is what it's like. Experience is different. And we all see that in life. That when you experience something, when you live through it, it's different. It's like me telling you that you can find joy in tribulation. That's what the Bible says. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. I can tell you that. You can read it. You know it. I know it. But then when you actually go through the trials and you count it all joy, you know it differently, don't you? There are psalms like that. You read a psalm and, okay, fine. But then you read that same psalm when you are in the middle of a situation that's just like what the psalmist is talking about. Oh, man, it hits you. Now, Jesus learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Jesus came down here, and as it said in the previous chapter, as you look at Jesus, he was tempted in all ways just like us, yet without sin. So here's Jesus. Does he now know, once he came and walked in the flesh, does he know about what it's like to be tempted? Yeah. Does he know what it's like to be hungry? Yeah. Does he know what it's like to be frustrated? And yeah. I mean, you name it. He's been through it. He suffered. The Bible refers to Jesus as a man of sorrows. This is a guy who knew what a rough life was like, even to the point of death. Jesus himself said, the birds have nests and foxes have holes, but I don't have anywhere to lay my head. I know what it's like to not belong anywhere. I have no home here on earth. It's just rough to feel like a stranger in the world. So when you feel like that, he knows what it's like. So here, as you look at Jesus, Jesus is familiar with weakness like every high priest, except he didn't sin to get there, but he was tempted in all ways. He does know what it's like to have all of those struggles in his life just like you. And so he knows what it's like to be weak. And as we've mentioned before, he knows beyond your capacity in almost every area. As you look at anything, just take hunger. You know what it's like to be hungry. How much does Jesus know what it's like to be hungry? 40 days hungry. That's how hungry he knows how to be. And so he can be gentle with you because he knows what it's like to walk a day in your shoes. Then the last thing is he must be given honor by God. God must choose him to be the high priest. Even with these first three, Jesus couldn't be the high priest just by saying, I want to be him. But what does the text say? Here in chapter 5, he quotes from the 110th Psalm in verse 6. Verse 6 is a quotation from the 110th Psalm, and he says in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, forget about Melchizedek for a second. I just want you to just take that and say, okay, there's a word, there's a name, put it in the back of your head, and then totally forget about it, because we're not going to talk about it again until chapter 7. All I want you to see in this verse is, what did the Father call him in the Psalm? What did the Holy Spirit have the psalmist write down about the Messiah? You are a what forever? Priest. So who called Jesus a priest? God did. God gave him that honor. And of course, down in verse 10, it reiterates that, saying, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So here's Jesus. In every way, the best high priest you could get. Now, I want you to go back to chapter 4. Now go back to chapter 4 and let's consider these verses. Having then a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Now here's an interesting thing. When it says he's passed through the heavens, this could be taken either way. When Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, and after he spent those 40 days out there with his apostles and disciples, he went up to the Mount of Olives, and where did he go? He passed through the heavens. So it could be saying, you have a high priest who is now, where is your high priest? Where is he at? Now, where was Aaron at? When Aaron was high priest, he was down here on earth. But you have a high priest who is up there in heaven, right before the throne of majesty. Now, I think that's the one he's talking about. But it would also be true the other way. When Jesus came to this earth, where did he come from? Albuquerque? Heaven, right? So, in either way, you could say, well, we have a high priest. Where did he come from? Where's your high priest from? My high priest is from Aaron. He's from the lineage of Aaron. Oh, yeah? Well, my high priest, he's from God's hand. He's from heaven. Whew, okay, you win. Or it could be, where's your high priest right now? Ours is over here at the temple. You say, oh, really? Mine's up in heaven, standing before God right now, interceding for me. Whew, okay, you win. Do you see how it doesn't matter either way? In both cases, you got the same thing, but the context doesn't necessarily tell us one way or the other. I think it leans towards where he is now. But then you look down there, and it says, since we have that kind of high priest, Jesus, who is he, by the way? Jesus, the Son of God. Could Aaron say that? Nope. Let us hold fast our confession. What kind of high priest you have? Hold on, folks. Hold on. Don't let go. Hold on. Then, verse 15, for we have not a high priest. Now, that's a double negative way of saying it. We have not a high priest that cannot. We have not a high priest that cannot. We would say in English, we have a high priest that can. We have a high priest that can be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. One that has been in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Now, what's the point there? High priest has to be gentle with you. He has to be patient. He has to know what it's like to be weak. So when you come to him and you say, I've sinned, I've done it, could you go ask God to forgive me? He has to understand and have compassion in his heart for you. What kind of a high priest is Jesus? He cares. I want you to realize he cares. You matter. You're important to him. You're not just some number. You're not just some person. You are one of his. In fact, he's so close to you and you matter so much to him, he refers to the church as his body. You're as close to him as my finger is to me. And you know what? If you decide to chop this finger off, I might have something to say about it. I might be a little upset. In the same way, Jesus, when anybody has ever hurt or attacked his people, what has he said? What did he say to Saul on the road to Damascus? He spoke to Saul and he said, why do you persecute me? Doesn't say, why do you persecute my people? He said, why do you persecute me? That's how close he is. That's how much he's touched with feeling with our infirmities. And then verse 16, let us therefore draw near with boldness unto the throne of grace. Now, as we mentioned with that drawing near with boldness, that's the idea of confidence. But then he says, what do you do to draw near? Draw near to the throne of grace. Now this is an interesting thing for us to think about. Draw near with boldness unto the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and might find grace to help us in time of need. Now normally what we talk about is on the judgment day, God's going to sit on a throne of what? Do we say God will sit on a throne of grace on the day of judgment? Is that how we talk about it? It isn't at all. How we talk about it is say God will sit on the throne of judgment. Now, is that true? Yes, He will sit on a throne of judgment, but He'll also, that same throne will be a throne of grace to Christ's people. So when you go and you say, now I'm going to die someday and I'm going to go stand before God's throne, right before my Creator. I can't even fathom such a thing. You know, we talk about God all the time. As Christians, He's just constantly something we talk about. But can you imagine there'll be a day you're going to meet Him? You're going to meet Him. And you can look forward to that day because for you, that throne He's sitting on is a throne of grace. That's a gracious throne for you. It's a merciful throne. It's a throne of compassion for you in your time of need. That's the kind of throne that God sits on for us. Why? Because who's going to sit at His right hand? As God's sitting on His throne of judgment, who's right there, right next to Him, right at His right hand? Jesus, your high priest. So you come up before that throne, and here's going to be Jesus saying, that one belongs to me. Oh, well, there's no judgment for you. Come on in. That's why I say that these verses in chapter 4 are the conclusion to the evidence you're going to get in chapter 5. Anybody have any comments or questions on that? Okay, so now we're going to move on down, and we move down to verse 11. Now, as we start in verse 11, we're going to begin a parenthetical section. Parenthetical section is just a section where normally you'd write and you'd put those little parentheses on the sides. And all it means is, we've been talking about this one thing, now I'm going to step aside and talk about something else. And I'll get back to my main point, but I digress. Now, this parenthetical section is big. It goes from verse 11 of chapter 5 and covers all of chapter 6. So it's a big, big section. And this section, we're moving from our main topic, which is, let's look at Jesus and what kind of a Jesus we have. What quality of a Savior is Jesus Christ? That's the main topic of Hebrews. And here we're going to stop and we're going to talk about us. The Hebrew writer is going to say, now I want to talk about you for a second. I've been talking about Jesus, but now I want to talk about you and what's been happening to you with your drifting and sluggishness and so on and so forth. So, look here in verse 10, we can see of chapter 5 verse 10, we've been talking about Jesus, Jesus our high priest, Jesus according to the order of Melchizedek, and then you get down to chapter 7 and in verse 1, and what does it start with? For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. Now we're going to talk about Melchizedek. So you see what we do is we go from verse 10 all the way over to chapter 7, and you could cut this section out. That's what I want you to see. You could cut verse 11 through 20 out, and there'd be continuity in the book. Of course, we're not going to cut it out because there's a lot of really good stuff in there, but it's a side topic. And the side topic that he's going to be dealing with is becoming dull of hearing. He's going to exhort them and say, look, wake up. Wake up and find that passion in your heart again. Return to that love of Christ. Drive forward with an active service to God. Come on, get up. Get up and do something with yourself. Don't just be a pew sitter. Wake up and do the Lord's work. Wake up and learn about the Lord. Wake up and become the kind of person you ought to be. And he's going to do that from verse 11 all the way through chapter 6. So it's an aside, but it's an aside that's important because it gets down to the heart of the issue. Why are we learning about Christ, all these great things about Christ? So we'll wake up, and we won't be dull of hearing. So we'll do something with it. So, verse 11. Concerning him, that is concerning Melchizedek, we have much to say, and it's hard to explain since you become dull of hearing. So he says, now I want to talk to you more about Melchizedek. So in fact, what he does is kind of what I did. Said, now, remember that name Melchizedek? What did I tell you? Put it in the back of your mind, forget about it for a while, we'll get back to it later. That's what he says. I'd like to tell you more about Melchizedek and how Jesus is like him, but you got a problem we got to deal with first. Your hearing's dull. Now that word dull is is a word for lazy. You're a lazy listener. We've all done it, and we've all seen it in others. Somebody sits down, and maybe there's something interesting on the television. Maybe you go to a restaurant and they've got TVs on. It drives me crazy. You have the TVs going on, and you're trying to talk, and then you notice they're no longer looking at you. They're off at the game. Now, I'm all about the game. I like the game too, but let's pick one. And so they're often, and they become a lazy listener. And husbands especially do this, right? Sure, honey, yeah, yeah. That's what that word dull hearing means. I'm only hearing just enough to I kind of heard there's a buzzing going on. That's what he's saying. Oh, yeah, you listen to God. You know what the Scriptures say, but you're lazy about it. You don't really know the text. You don't really know what the Lord has to say. And so he says, I've got a lot I'd like to tell you, but it's hard to explain because you become dull of hearing. Now, there's a big point there. And that point is, the Bible is just as deep as the ocean with wisdom from God. It's just so deep you cannot reach the bottom of it. But if you are a dull hearer, you'll never get more than a shallow depth of it. You'll never get anywhere. There will be people who will spend their whole lives in the Lord's church, and they never get off skimming the surface of the deepest pool of wisdom the world has ever seen, because they're just lazy listeners. They don't plumb its depths. They don't ask the questions. They don't dive in and really try and pull out what does God mean in that. When they don't understand a verse, they just go, well, whatever. And they don't try and learn these things for themselves. So if you look at the Bible and you say, well, there's not a whole lot there, or you get dull and you say, oh, it's boring, you've got that feeling. You know, that I've got what I can get out of it, and then basically at this point it's just rinse and repeat. You become dull of hearing. That's what I'm telling you. You become dull of hearing. If you feel like, well, I sit in a class or I'll pick up the Bible once in a while to appease my conscience, but I'm not learning anything anymore, you become dull of hearing. You're not listening because there's a whole lot there, but it's hard to explain if you're a dull listener. So then now verse 12 he says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you've come to need milk and not solid food. Now he's going to use an analogy in here between a baby and a full-grown adult. A baby needs milk, an adult eats solid food. The idea of that is strong rations. It's kind of like what you would feed somebody in the military. You give them fuel, right? You open up that MRE, and it's got stuff to keep a guy marching for a 20-mile march. That's what solid food is. Now, you don't start with solid food. A man's got to work up to get to the strength of it. He'll start with milk. Now, he'll use that analogy of a baby compared to a full-grown man, and he'll say the Scriptures are that way. There's milk in the Scriptures, and then there's solid food. Now, the analogy, though, breaks down, and he shows it here in one point. A baby only gets older. You ever seen a full-grown man turn into a baby? Doesn't happen, does it? Look here in the text. Down in verse 12, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God. You need to go back to milk. I thought we were past this. You got to go back. Now this can happen with a Christian. A Christian can degrade because your soul is not like your body. He says, by this time you should be teaching, you should be equipped, you should be on solid food all the time, but instead I just see you falling back into baby stage. You keep going back to the infant stuff. And there's a very important point in that, And when he makes the statement, it says, though by this time you ought to be teachers, there's a marker. So I don't know about everybody else, but for me, I like to have some way of denoting, am I doing what the Lord would have me to do? Here's a way to do it. You know you are growing into the solid food if you can now teach it. Now that idea of you ought to be teachers by now doesn't mean everybody should be getting in the pulpit. That's not the point. But the idea is that you could convey knowledge to somebody else. So that when your friend and your neighbor asked about the gospel, you would have something intelligent to say about it. After all, isn't that the idea of when somebody asks you about the hope that was within you, you need to be ready to give an answer. And so here is a road marker for us. You say, am I growing as I ought? Well, here's how you know. Are you moving towards the point where you could not just know it, but you could explain it? Now, you don't have to do that overnight. There's a recognition that you start out as a babe, but every one of us should be moving towards that. And if you're not, we've got to pay attention to those verses. We may have a problem. And so you should have solid food at a certain point. And he says, verse 13, for everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, but he's an infant. That is, he's a baby spiritually. And babies spiritually are just like babies physically. They're weak. They need a lot of care. They don't really do anything for anybody else. They need constant nourishment and attention all the time. And there's a time to be that babe, but there's a time to stop being that babe and contributing and helping and doing good for others. And then verse 14, he says, solid food is for the mature. So who's the mature? The mature are those who can eat the solid food. The mature are those who can then teach what they know to others. Who, because of practice, that word practice means exercise. Because of exercise, they have their senses trained to discern good and evil. They can tell the difference between right and wrong. They're able to clearly see the road markers of this will get me in trouble or this will be the right way to handle it. And they're able to then teach those things to others, right? Because they're not just able to discern between good and evil for themselves, they're also at the point where they can now teach so that they can not just make sure they stay out of evil and head towards good, but they can prepare others to head towards good and flee from evil. And so he's making this point. It all starts with those ears. You're dull of hearing. If you're a lazy hearer of the gospel, you will never become the kind of person that you ought to be. And it can even work to the point where you have somebody who's growing and then they slip back into infant stage. They slip back again to where they need milk and they've got to start over because they've not been applying themselves to becoming the kind of people Lord intends. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay. So, next week we'll be reading through chapter 6. So if you're reading ahead, chapter 6 is the chapter to read. We'll continue and finish up this parenthetical section on exhortation.